Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be looking at my top 10 greatest films of all time. Obviously a subjective list, but this is, in my opinion, the top 10 greatest films of all time. Now, a lot of good films are going to be left off of this list for obvious reason. I've watched a lot of films. I've actually watched probably more films than I have read books, even though I've spent more cumulative time reading books, just because of the duration of a film being about an hour and a half and probably taking me about 5 hours to read a book on average. Now, I don't obviously read those books in one sitting either. On top of that, I want to launch into some stats today before I give you the list of films. So for decades, we have every decade since and including the 1960s on this list, except for the 2000s. And the 80s and the 2010s are represented the most, with each having 3 on this list. And then for countries, half of the list, 5 of them are going to be made up of the US, films from the US, and then 3 of them from Italy, and 1 from each Poland, and now not a country, the USSR. Let's launch into it. The Great Beauty by Paolo Sorrentino is indeed a very, very beautiful film, although I found that it is much more about, in subject matter, decline than it is about beauty. The main character, Jep Gambardella, is very much kind of an older rich man who is in decline in many ways. People around him, friends, relatives, have started to die, and he's seen attending a couple funerals in the film. And then on top of that, he wrote a novel, a great novel about 30 years ago that got really popular, but he hasn't written another novel since, and people are always asking him, why did you never write a novel? And we never, that's kind of the central question of the film, and we never get a really good answer to it until the end, which is probably, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful wrap-ups in film history. And there's also a lot of commentary on the religious order. It contrasts the very religious and legalistic order of like a cardinal who's very vain, and then it contrasts that with a very pious and sincere nun. And so it makes fun of religion in a sense, but it also praises true religion. So there's a lot to cover in this film that I can't really go completely into, and that's what makes it so dense and so great. But it's about the true religion, about the search for meaning in life, and the nature of beauty, and I would definitely recommend watching it.
Listen.
Making his first appearance on this list is my favorite director, Federico Fellini. And La Dolce Vita was, for me, a very compelling viewing experience. And about halfway through it, I paused and grabbed myself a shot of espresso and just proceeded to sip on that espresso as I watched the film, and really felt as if I was actually in the film. There's great many beautiful scenes in this film uh, with long shots and music laced into the background, and it follows Marcello Mastroianni's character, who I believe in this film is actually named Marcello, who is an Italian journalist who spends much of his time in Rome at cabarets and at restaurants with elite, and spending his time having flings with multiple different girls. And there's some very deep themes in this film. You just have to search a little harder to find them than you do in The Great Beauty.
Paris, Texas?
I love all of Wim Wenders' films, but Paris, Texas is exceptional to me. And it is about a man named Travis who shows up in the desert of Texas. He's been gone, missing for 4 years, and he's mute at first and refuses to speak, and we don't really know much about him. And it's a family drama, and The central question is what happened 4 years ago between Travis and his wife. Travis's brother shows up in Texas to pick him up and to go live with his brother and his wife and Travis's son, who has been living with them. And we don't really get an answer to the question of what happened to Travis and his wife 4 years ago uh, for a long time in the film. And it has, at the end of the film, the most beautiful, well put together, protracted scene in all of film history. So I encourage you to stick with this one, and you will be rewarded. The Last Temptation of Christ is a very interesting character study in Jesus being fully man and fully God. And the important thing to understand about this film is that it's not trying to add to Christianity in any way, and it's also not trying to be accurate to the biblical story at the same time. It's just exploring an idea about Jesus' humanity further. So it follows a lot of the same tales of the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ, but it also adds to that some exploration of temptations that he might have had, including sexual temptations and the temptation to start a family or even to get down from the cross. And obviously, these temptations were there, and there are times where it's written about Jesus' temptation in the Bible, and we might not see all of those times. So this story really focuses on that aspect of Jesus' humanity. Is based on the novel of the same name, and it has some beautiful imagery in it and great acting by Willem Dafoe and others. And it's definitely worth watching for all Christians who want to explore that idea of Jesus being tempted and always resisting that temptation.
So we're just going to ignore the bear then?
Midsommar fell a few spots on my list in recent months, but it is still my favorite horror movie. And it is about a group of graduate students who travel to Sweden with their friend to visit his village back there and go to the Midsommar and experience the Midsommar festivities with them. And some of them are anthropologists, but the main character is Danny, and she's a psychology student, and she's heartbroken over a horrible tragedy that happened in her family, with her sister killing her parents and then proceeding to kill herself. And so obviously a very disturbing scene in the beginning, and they don't actually show it as it happens, but the aftermath is still pretty horrifying. And Danny at this point is kind of, even though there are horrible things happening at the Midsommar festivities from an American lens, she kind of finds a home with the Swedish people who are very accepting of her. And this film will certainly disgust you and horrify you in certain ways, but it also will kind of open your mind in other ways and cause you to think in a lot of ways. And that's kind of what it's doing, is telling us there's several things in our own culture that we never examine fully. But if we were to go to a Midsommar festivity like this, which we don't actually know what it's like, but we might be judging the other culture. And I think that this film encourages us to be more introspective and less blindly unaccepting of other people's customs that might be just even less strange than our own customs, and we don't know it.
She wore blue.
Blue Velvet is definitely my favorite of David Lynch's films because he perfectly combines a fairly down-to-earth detective story with his more common style of like a surrealist type story that we see in Twin Peaks and Eraserhead, and his surrealist style that is even called just Lynchian. It's so unique. And The main character, Jeffrey, finds a severed ear on his way home from work or school, I'm not sure which one, and brings it down to the detective station. And the detective tells him not to get involved, to stay out of it, but he does accept the ear. And Jeffrey, of course, does get involved. And he also, to make matters worse in some sense, begins to date the detective's daughter, Sandy, who is played by Laura Dern. So it's starred by Kyle MacLachlan as Jeffrey and Laura Dern as Sandy. And she shows him the woman's apartment that his dad, she's heard her dad referencing very many times. And Jeffrey sneaks into the woman's apartment, kind of with Laura's help, but a little bit on his own, and gets way too involved. And I'll stop my explanation there, but this is just masterful in the Lynchian style. I love the scene where Dorothy Valens is singing Blue Velvet, and the acting performances are all incredible, including the acting performance from the villain, who is Frank Hopper, and who is generally the most disturbing, the most frightening acting performance I've seen from a villain ever. And it is definitely worth watching for all of those acting performances and for that cherry on the cake of the Lynchian style to go along with it.
Eliminate the writer from the artistic process. If we can just get rid of these actors and directors, maybe we got something here.
It's not about someone who plays a game, it's about a player. And the player is played by Tim Robbins, and his name is Griffin Mill. And he is a Hollywood studio executive who, throughout the course of the film, does many ignoble things, and that's kind of what the film is about in a sense. And he's a Hollywood studio executive who gets death threats about someone whose script he supposedly rejected, and he finds this writer, and when he finds the writer, things go wrong. Generally, this film just hit all the right notes, and it has tons of good celebrity cameos, including Angelica Houston, Bruce Willis, and so many others that I can't even remember all of them. But everything about it is so self-reflective, so self-contained, and the story just ties together perfectly in the end.
Dwa serduszka, cztery oczy. Oj, oj, oj.
Cold War is an incredible Polish film from 2018 that is shot in black and white as a stylistic choice rather than just a choice out of necessity. And that and so many other things in the film make it so beautiful. It is about Victor, who is a traveling music director with a Polish troupe that works for the government, and Zula, who is a student in that troupe, and she's younger but not a minor. And they fall in love and plan on going to cross into the other side of Europe, the free side of Europe. And so they're in West Berlin and plan on crossing into East Berlin. But for whatever reason, Victor crosses and Zula decides to stay. And their love kind of seems like a foregone conclusion at this point, until several years later they meet up again in Paris, kind of randomly. And this is obviously a very episodic film that takes place over several years, but it flows together perfectly. It lets the music just move through the characters so well, with examples like Victor playing the piano in a jazz club, and as he does so, Zula getting up on the counter and drunkenly dancing, and Zula singing for a record label. And their love just ultimately feels real and like a real story. I heard one review of somebody who was like, this is the exact same story as my parents. And though it takes place in the Cold War, unlike many Cold War movies, it is not an explicitly political film. It mostly follows the human interests. Stalker is another film with another potentially misleading title, as it's not about a stalker as you might think of it in terms of an internet stalker or someone who stalks people, but someone in a science fiction society that's very post-nuclear who leads people into this place called the Zone, which is a restricted area guarded by the military where a comet landed several years ago, and it doesn't necessarily follow the laws of physics. And in the film, we see him leading three men into the Zone, and in the Zone, they will be granted, there's a room in the Zone where he's going to lead them to where they could be granted their deepest desires. And this film poses a lot of philosophical questions. It's a really lot of interesting philosophical conversation between the men. It does this really cool thing where it switches from this brown, sepia, brown film in the beginning to when they get into the Zone, they ride this train into the Zone, it all of a sudden switches into color, and we have all this vibrant greenery and this flowing water in the Zone. And at times it switches back and forth between this brown film and this color film. And so that's a really unique directorial choice. And it also poses the question of whether we would actually want our deepest desires granted if we knew truly what they were. Of all of Federico Fellini's films, 8 1/2 is definitely my favorite, although not by much, just because of how incredible all of his other films are. It is about Guido Anselmi, a film director who is struggling and lacks creative vision for his next film. And he is being pressed on all sides, and people, especially his producer, are wanting him to move forward on his next project. Guido is played by Marcello Mastroianni, just like in La Dolce Vita, and his incredible acting performance. And the lines between dream and reality really begin to blur in this film as Guido begins to cast characters to play characters who are people in his own life and to make a film that is pretty autobiographical. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that he's having these flashbacks throughout the film and dreams about his own childhood, about his fantasies, and we get to see into his life his strained relationship with his wife and his mistress, and really just how depraved he can be, but also just how lost he is. And it is really hard to put into my words my admiration for this film. Though every other movie, film on this list is incredible, really good, 8 1/2 is just on another level, so much higher above all of the rest. And it is a perfectly self-contained work that really draws on a theme that's in a lot of Fellini's work, which is that circus life nature of life, people moving through life as if they're members of a cast of sorts. And the last scene in the movie really ties this together. And if you watch it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And it's just a perfect film about a lack of creative vision and creative struggles, and also about the formational memories and the dreams that we have. Those are the 10 greatest films of all time, in my personal opinion, that I have seen. And I want to know what your list looks like. So if you have a personal list, go ahead and put that down in the comments. I'm going to be doing more film reviews. So if you like this content, hit subscribe and hit that like button down below. And I'll see you next time.